Isn't it curious that God could raise Jesus from the dead, theologian Richard Hayes asks, but didn't heal the nail wounds in his hands? Leaving Christ's wounds intact seems pretty important, since the resurrected one presents those wounds to the disciples so that they will recognize him. Christ, who can now miraculously appear behind locked and closed doors, needs some way of authenticating himself as the same person who was crucified. And he does it with his wounds. The way John tells it, this is also very important to Thomas. Thomas doesn't ask Jesus to tell a familiar story or perform a signature sign. He wants to see his wounds. After all, the disciples have witnessed the execution of their teacher, the one they believe is the Messiah. What Thomas now hopes for isn't the God of retribution who comes back to clean house, nor is it the God that we heard about in Revelation, the Alpha and the Omega, who comes to judge and sets things in order. It is the God who knows pain and suffering and loss and death. The God who knows what my pain and what your pain feels like. There is no comfort quite like the comfort of someone else knowing your pain, of having someone else knowing the hurt that you carry, of knowing what your fears feel like, of knowing what your loss feels like. It's one of the blessings of a grief support group or AA, or taking a walk with that friend who's been through something similar to what you have been through. I'll never forget the early weeks of going through a divorce, reaching out to a friend who is also a pastor who had also gone through the same thing. And when I told her what was going on, she texted me to meet her and her friend at a restaurant halfway between our cities that very night. She and her friend had completely changed their plans just to sit with me that night. "Welcome to the club nobody ever wanted to join," she said with a tender hug. And my tears that night were the ones that come when you sit with someone who knows your kind of pain. Of course, there are limits to that kind of knowing. I sit with people in pain all the time who are going through things that I have never gone through. Losing a sibling or a parent or a child. How could I ever say, I know what that feels like? And even when someone else's circumstances seem to line up with your own, your pain is still your pain. When we pour out a painful story, my friend Meg Peary McLaughlin writes, a testimony of truth and torment. When, like a t-shirt, we turn our feelings inside out, we don't want someone to say, I know exactly what that feels like. Because, she writes, it's my hurt, my story, unique, singular. No one else can really know what it feels like. Maybe you know what it feels like to lose a spouse, but you don't know what it feels like to lose my spouse. Maybe you know what it feels like to look for a job, but you don't know what it means for me, for my family, for my finances, for my ego. Maybe you know about cancer because you had a lumpectomy, but you don't know my weariness and worry. You don't know my hot flashes and headaches. You don't know. But of course, Meg points out, we do want someone to know. We want someone to know exactly what it feels like. Some kinds of pain are too much to bear alone. We want someone to know. Theologian Jürgen Moltmann wrote in his groundbreaking book, The Crucified God, of the significance of Christ's suffering for God's relationship with human beings. Because Moltmann's theology is hard enough to understand on its own, I'm going to keep his traditional Trinitarian language here that the author uses in his book. On the cross, he writes, the Son suffers dying, the Father suffers the death of the Son. The grief of the Father here is just as important as the death of the Son. The fatherlessness of the Son is matched by the sonlessness of the Father. And if God has constituted God's self as the Father of Jesus Christ, then he also suffers the death of his fatherhood in the death of his Son. In the cross, Moltmann says, Father and Son are most deeply separated in forsakenness, and at the same time are most inwardly one in their surrender. What proceeds from this event between Father and Son is the Spirit, which justifies the godless, fills the forsaken with love, and even brings the dead alive, since even the fact that they are dead cannot exclude them from this event on the cross. The death in God also includes them. What happens on the cross, Moltmann says, was an event between God and God. It was a deep division in God himself, insofar as God abandoned God and contradicted himself, and at the same time, a unity in God, insofar as God was at one with God and corresponded to himself. I take all this to mean that God is irrevocably marked by the deep experience of forsakenness on the cross, of truly experiencing that terrible feeling of being completely alone in one's experience of death and forsakenness. And this experience is paradoxically how we know that in our deepest experiences of dislocation, of loss, and of pain, God is most present with us. The wounds of Christ are his credentials to the suffering race of humanity, William Temple wrote. Which is what Jesus tries to give Thomas there in that room. Notice, he doesn't try to convince him to believe with an argument. He doesn't even bring a theological conversation. He shows Thomas his wounds. As my friend Meg says, it is almost as if Jesus points to his hands and says, Thomas, I know. It is almost as if he points to his side and says, Thomas, I know. It is at this point in the story that Thomas's full confession comes, my Lord and my God. It is when Thomas sees, perhaps for the first time, that the wounded Christ is not the obstacle that prevents us from believing, but the key to understanding the full significance of God's incarnation. The God who attends to our wounds is the same God who has experienced them. Experienced betrayal, denial, physical suffering, abandonment, the sense of being totally and utterly alone. There is nothing that you can experience that God has not already known. This week in the Bible study, we offered prayers for Ukraine, and some of us were angry that the U.S. isn't doing more to stop the killing. Others of us are worried that doing more than our nation is already doing could launch World War III. But I would say all of us were unified in a sense of powerlessness to do more to stop the killing. We were limited to prayer, and those prayers felt small. And I know that often a lot of us are frustrated with the kind of thoughts and prayers culture that sometimes serves to excuse Christians from taking action. We want to see action on climate change and gun violence and racial justice and a host of other things that we do have the power to change. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. But it seems to me there are also times in our lives when we cannot avoid the sense of powerlessness that we experienced in our Bible study on Wednesday. Powerlessness to change the destructive direction of someone you love. Powerlessness to get a different public outcome in Ukraine or even in your own neighborhood. Powerlessness in the face of an unwanted diagnosis for you or someone you love. Powerlessness in the face of your own grief. And while that kind of powerlessness might sometimes drive you to additional action, other times the only action is coming to terms with the hard truth that some kinds of suffering we cannot change. Some kinds of pain we have to sit with and muck through. And God seems more than willing to do this with us. I mean, if God didn't care about anything but action, then Jesus would have left those disciples in their fear behind those locked and closed doors and went with Mary Magdalene at the beginning, the only disciple on Easter morning, according to John's gospel, who seems ready to go to the world. She was the one who saw Jesus in the garden and then ran to tell the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." The rest of the disciples seem to ignore her, afraid of what lies outside those doors. It's like God knows that sometimes the best action, maybe the only action, is to sit with someone in their fear, to wait on them in their pain, to let that pain have its hearing, trusting that there is life somewhere beyond it, somewhere through it. No, actually trusting that there is life in it, with the scars that are always left when you do give yourself to something beyond yourself, a mission, a cause, a vocation, a person. I suppose the God who is able to raise Jesus from the dead might also be able to remove the scars from Christ's hands. But that's not the distant kind of God Christ is to us. This is the God, remember, who chooses to be born to an unwed teenage mother. This is the God who chooses to be born a Jew to a vulnerable people who always seem to be running from some kind of persecution. This is the God who chooses to live with fisher people and others on the margins, scraping to get by day to day. This is the God who refuses power over people through violence, believing instead that love of the other is the most powerful way to live. And this is the God who chooses to experience pain, not because God relishes it or wills it for anyone, but because to be human includes knowing pain. This is the God we can call on, pray to, sit with in our deepest, most difficult hours. The one who promised that abundant living can be found, must be found with our wounds.